The hiss of the coffee maker was the only sound I allowed myself to focus on. It was a familiar ritual, the steam rising from the cheap store-brand grounds, the slow, percussive drip into the glass carafe. The morning light, weak and pale, filtered through the window over the sink, illuminating the faint scuffs on the linoleum floor and the worn wooden cabinets I'd repainted myself 2 summers ago. I was in my uniform, a pair of faded jeans, with a smear of dried paint on one knee and an old flannel shirt, soft from 100 washes. It was a comfortable uniform, one that spoke of honest work and simple needs. I could hear Leo's voice from the living room, a low animated murmur that was slowly rising in pitch. He was on the phone with Sarah, his girlfriend of 6 months. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. In a house this small, sound carried like a secret you couldn't keep. The walls were thin, the spaces intimate. You learned to tune out the background noise of each other's lives, to grant a semblance of privacy through selective hearing. But then his words sharpened, cutting through the morning quiet and the comforting hiss of the coffee maker. They weren't just words, they were darts, each one finding a chink in the armor of my contentment. I know it's embarrassing. My hand, which had been reaching for a mug from the cupboard, stilled. The tone wasn't just frustrated, it was laced with a venomous shame I'd never heard from him before. He's a handyman, a glorified janitor. The words landed with a physical weight. A handyman. I fixed Mrs. Gable's porch steps last week, steadying them so she wouldn't fall. I'd spent 3 days troubleshooting the ancient wiring in the Jensen's garage. Not just patching it, but understanding its old, illogical pathways and making it safe. It was a trade of logic and patience, of solving small, tangible puzzles that made people's lives a little better, a little safer. To him, it was just a title, a label that carried the stink of failure. We live in this tiny house. I can't even invite you over. My eyes scanned the kitchen. It was small, yes. The countertops were formica, the refrigerator hummed a little too loudly on hot days. But it was clean. It was warm. The table in the corner was where we'd shared 1,000 meals, where he'd done his homework while I sketched out repair plans. It was a home. I had poured every ounce of my care into making it one, and he was ashamed of it. Ashamed of the roof I'd provided. Then came the final blow, the one that didn't just criticize my present, but dismissed my entire existence. He has no ambition, no legacy. What future do I have with a father like that? The coffee pot was in my hand now, full and hot. I had been in the motion of pouring, but my body froze, locking into place. The rich, bitter scent of the brew filled my nostrils, but I couldn't smell it anymore. All I could feel was the heat of the glass against my palm and a cold, spreading numbness in my chest. No legacy. The words echoed in the silent chamber of my mind. What did he think a legacy was? A bank account? A name on a building? I had thought my legacy was the man he was becoming. The quiet lessons in fixing what was broken, in being reliable, in finding satisfaction in a job well done. I had thought my legacy was the stability I provided, the fact that he never had to wonder if I'd be there, if the lights would stay on, if there would be food on the table. It wasn't a flashy legacy, but I had believed it was a solid one, built on a foundation of constancy, not currency. But he didn't see any of that. All he saw was the smallness of the house, the simplicity of the work clothes, the lack of a fancy car in the driveway. He saw a man who had settled, a man with no grand designs, and in his eyes that made me less. It made him less by association. I stood there, a statue in my own kitchen, the weight of his disappointment a heavier burden than any load of lumber I'd ever carried. I didn't turn, I didn't let my posture slump or my breath hitch. I had spent a lifetime mastering the art of stillness, of controlling the surface while storms raged beneath. I carefully, silently, set the full coffee pot back on its hot plate. The gentle clink of glass on metal was the only sound I made. I stared at the dark liquid, my reflection warped and indistinct in the curved glass. The man looking back at me was the one my son saw. A handyman, a glorified janitor, a man with no ambition, and in that frozen moment, as the steam continued to rise, I felt the first hairline fracture appear in the quiet, simple world I had so carefully built for us. The insult wasn't about the money. It was a judgment on my entire life's worth, and the shame he felt was a poison I had never meant for him to drink. The morning after I overheard Leo, the sun rose the same way it always did. It came in through the kitchen window over the sink, hitting the faded linoleum floor in a long, warm rectangle. I stood in that rectangle, feeling the heat on my socks, and I made my coffee. It was the same cheap dark roast I always bought. The ritual was a comfort. Measure the grounds, pour the water, listen for the first gurgle of life from the machine. It was a simple process with a predictable, satisfying result. That's the kind of thing I've always appreciated. Our house is small. You could probably fit the whole thing into the garage of some of the homes I've worked on. But it's tidy. Every tool has its place on the pegboard in the utility room. Every dish is dried and put away after it's washed. The floors are swept, the surfaces are clear. It's not about being fussy, it's about order. In an ordered space, your mind is free. You aren't distracted by chaos. You can see things for what they are. My truck sits in the driveway, an old Ford F-150 that's more rust than paint at this point. But the engine purrs. I've rebuilt most of it myself. It's reliable. It gets me where I need to go, and it carries my tools. That's all a vehicle needs to do. It doesn't need to make a statement. Most days my work finds me. Mrs. Gable down the street with a stuck window. Old Mr. Henderson with a lawnmower that won't start. I don't do it for the money they press into my palm, though I accept it to be polite. I do it for the quiet, for the solitude of a dusty garage or a silent backyard, and for the satisfaction. There's a moment when you're working on something broken where the problem reveals itself to you. A stripped gear, a corroded wire, a warped piece of wood. And in that moment, the solution is suddenly perfectly clear. It's a kind of truth. You take the broken pieces, you apply logic and patience and a gentle touch, and you make it whole again. You restore function. You fix what was wrong. It's a clean, honest feeling. I move through these tasks with a kind of economy. No wasted motion. When I approach a lock that won't turn, I don't just yank on it or spray it with oil. I hold the key, feeling the subtle feedback through the cold metal. I look at the alignment of the deadbolt in the striker plate. I analyze the wear on the key itself. I'm not just a handyman looking for a quick fix. I'm a strategist assessing a system, identifying the single point of failure. It's a habit of mind I can't seem to shake. I see the world in patterns of cause and effect, in vulnerabilities and strengths. This way of being extends to everything. The way I walk through a grocery store, always aware of the exits, the flow of people. The way I park my truck, not for convenience, but for the best line of sight and the easiest possible departure. It's a low-grade, constant state of assessment that runs in the background of my mind, a silent program that never shuts down. I've mastered the art of being invisible, not in a way that makes me a ghost, but in a way that makes me unremarkable. I'm the guy who fixes things. I'm a part of the neighborhood scenery. People see the work clothes, the calloused hands, the quiet demeanor, and they think they have me figured out. They don't see the calculation, they don't see the control. Up in my closet, on the top shelf, behind a stack of sweaters, there is a single locked metal box. It's not big, about the size of a thick dictionary. It's gunmetal grey, unadorned and heavy. The lock is a simple, sturdy keyhole. The key for it doesn't live on my key ring. It's tucked away in a separate, even more discreet location. I don't ever open it. I haven't in years. But its presence is a fact in my life, as solid and immovable as the foundation of this house. It's a line of demarcation. On one side is the man I am now, the father, the neighbor, the fixer. On the other side is a different kind of man, a man who operated in a world where the broken things weren't lawnmowers and locks, and the tools for fixing them weren't wrenches and screwdrivers. That box is my secret. Not a shameful one, but a deliberate one. I chose this small house, this reliable truck, this quiet life. I chose to be the man who is seen but never truly noticed. It was a choice made for peace, for safety, for a kind of freedom that doesn't come with wealth or power. I thought I was building a fortress of normalcy around my son. I thought I was controlling the situation by removing us from the game entirely. But now, after hearing his words, after feeling the sting of his shame, I'm starting to wonder if my fortress has become his cage. And that locked box on the shelf suddenly feels less like a relic and more like a loaded gun, waiting in the silence. The front door didn't slam. It sighed shut, a soft, defeated sound that was somehow worse than any angry crash could have been. I was in the living room, re-gluing a loose leg on Mrs. Gable's old oak side table. The scent of wood glue and lemon polish was a familiar comfort, a small solvable problem, in a world that felt increasingly full of the unsolvable kind. I didn't have to look up to know it was Leo. I knew the rhythm of his footsteps, the specific weight of his presence in a room. But this was different. This was the heavy, shuffling gait of a storm cloud, dense with a misery I could feel from across the house. He walked past the doorway to the living room without a glance, beelining for the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator door open and close, but no sound of a can or a bottle being opened, just silence. I kept working, my hands steady, applying just the right amount of pressure to the clamp. This was our dance. He needed space to process. I gave it to him by pretending to be absorbed in my work. But the air was thick, charged with a pain so potent it was a physical presence. I could feel the words he'd spoken on the phone days earlier echoing in the quiet. A glorified janitor. No ambition. No legacy. They had taken root in me, a cold, hard seed, and now I could feel something else growing in the room with us, his shame given a new, more powerful voice. After a few minutes, I set the clamp down and walked into the kitchen. He was just standing there, his back to me, leaning against the counter, his shoulders hunched up around his ears. He was staring out the small window above the sink, but I knew he wasn't seeing the familiar view of our backyard with its neat vegetable patch and my old tool shed. He was seeing something else entirely. "Leo?" I said, my voice quiet. He didn't turn. His whole body was a tightly coiled spring. "Her dad," he started, his voice rough, like gravel. "Mr. Sterling, he was waiting for me after school, pulled up in that stupid perfect car of his." I stayed silent, letting him unspool the thread. He didn't even get out, just rolled down the window and looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. Leo's hands, resting on the counter, curled into fists. He said it was time for this little charade to end, that his daughter needed to be with people from a stable social standing. He finally turned around then, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. It wasn't just teenage anger, it was a raw, gut-deep hurt, the kind that leaves a permanent mark. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He said she deserved a future, Dad. A real one, not one tied to someone with a lack of providence. Leo spat the words out, fancy words that weren't his, words that had been weaponized against him. He said you had no ambition. He all but called you a deadbeat. There it was, the judgment from on high, delivered not as an opinion, but as a verdict. And my son, my beautiful, smart boy, was standing in our kitchen, shattered by it. The insult he'd flung at me days ago in a moment of private frustration had now been validated by an external authority. It was no longer just his secret shame. It was his new, crushing reality. Why? The word was a plea, a crack in his voice. Why are we like this? He gestured vaguely around the small, tidy kitchen at our simple, functional life. Why don't you ever try for more? Other dads, they climb ladders, they build things, they leave a mark. We just exist here. He took a step toward me, his confusion curdling into something sharper, more accusatory. Is this it? Are you just okay with being nobody? The question hung in the air between us, sharp as a shard of glass. Being nobody. He didn't mention the phone call. He didn't have to. The subtext was a deafening roar. Mr. Sterling's voice had become his own. The world had told him his father was worthless, and in his pain and humiliation, he was starting to believe it. He wasn't just asking why we lived in a small house. He was asking why I had apparently chosen a life that made him a target for such contempt. He was asking why I had allowed this to happen to him. I looked at my son, truly looked at him, and I saw the boy who used to follow me around the yard, handing me tools, his small face full of admiration. That boy was gone, replaced by this young man whose spirit was being systematically broken by a narrative of inadequacy that I, through my silence, had helped write. In that moment, the quiet life I had so carefully constructed, the peace I had fought so hard to protect, felt like the most selfish lie I had ever told. The house was too quiet after he went to bed. Or maybe he hadn't gone to bed at all. The confrontation had left a static in the air, a charge that made the familiar walls of our home feel like they were pressing in. I'd cleaned the kitchen twice, wiped down counters that were already spotless, my hands moving on autopilot, while my mind replayed his words on a punishing loop. Why don't you ever try for more? I'd heard the anger in his voice, the frustration, but underneath it, I'd heard something else. Something far more dangerous, a genuine, bewildered plea. He truly couldn't understand my choices. To him, my life wasn't a philosophy. It was a failure, and that failure was now his inheritance. I finally gave up on the cleaning and walked to the back of the house, drawn by the faint, cool draft seeping from the mudroom. The door to the back porch was slightly ajar. I moved to close it, to lock up for the night, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting on the top step of the porch, his back to me, silhouetted against the deep indigo of the late evening. The cheap backyard security light cast a sickly yellow glow, just enough to see the outline of his shoulders. And they were slumped, not in the casual, tired way of a teenager after a long day, but in a profound, structural way, as if the very framework of him had given way. He was just staring out past our small, neat lawn, past the fence, into the dark expanse of the empty field behind our property. He was utterly still. The kind of stillness that isn't peaceful but absolute. It was the stillness of surrender. And that was the click. It wasn't a loud sound. It wasn't a dramatic crack of thunder or a shattering plate. It was a soft, internal, definitive click, like the final, quiet turn of a lock in a door I had been leaning against for 17 years. All the noise in my head, the rationalizations, the memories of a life I'd willingly left behind, the fierce, protective mantra that a simple life was a good life, just stopped. It was replaced by a single crystalline and horrifying image. I wasn't looking at my angry son. I wasn't looking at a boy wounded by a girl's father's cruel words. I was looking at a young man whose hope was broken. It was in the curve of his spine, a line of defeat I'd never seen on him before. It was in the way his head was slightly bowed, not in thought, but in acceptance. He wasn't planning his rebellion, or stewing in his anger. He had accepted the verdict, Mr. Sterling's verdict, the world's verdict. And now my verdict. He had looked at the man his father was and had seen a ceiling, a limit, a dead end. And he had decided there was no point in fighting it. My breath caught in my chest, sharp and cold. For all these years I had believed my silence was a shield. I had walked away from a world of power and noise and scrutiny to give him a childhood of quiet stability. I thought I was building him a fortress of normalcy, where his worth would be measured in character, not capital. I had mistaken my retreat for a strategic withdrawal, my invisibility for a form of strength. But in this moment, under the jaundiced glow of that porch light, I saw the truth with terrifying clarity. My silence wasn't a shield, it was a prison. I had built these quiet, modest walls not to protect him, but to hide myself. And in doing so, I had locked him in here with me. I had given him a life where his ambitions were seen as a rebuke of my choices. I had let him believe that our circumstances were a sentence, not a selection. My peace had come at the cost of his potential. My contentment had been the anchor around his neck. He thought I was nobody because I had worked so very hard to make him believe that was all I could be. The weight of that realization was physical, a pressure on my sternum that made it hard to breathe. The image of him on those steps, a statue of surrendered dreams, burned itself onto the back of my eyelids. This was my fault, not Mr. Sterling's, not the world's, mine. The man I used to be, the strategist, the analyst who could dismantle a complex problem into its component parts, stirred from a long slumber. He assessed the situation with a cold, detached efficiency. The primary objective was no longer my own peace. The primary objective was the restoration of that broken hope on the porch steps. The obstacle was not a person, but a perception. And I alone possessed the key to shattering it. The click was the sound of that key turning. The door I had been leaning against swung open, and I knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that I could not step back through it. The time for being invisible was over. The silence in the house after Leo went to his room was a physical weight. It wasn't the comfortable quiet I was used to, the kind filled with the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock and the distant hum of the neighborhood. This was a heavy, suffocating stillness, broken only by the echo of his words and the image of him on the porch. A young man's spirit bent under a weight I had let the world place on his shoulders. I walked to my bedroom, my movements slow, deliberate. Each step felt like wading through deep water. The worn floorboards, which usually felt like old friends under my feet, now seemed to creak with accusation. I stopped in front of the closet. It was just a simple sliding door closet, filled with flannel shirts and work pants, but in the far back, tucked behind a stack of winter blankets, was the one artifact from a life I had deliberately left behind. The metal box wasn't large, about the size of a thick ledger. It was gunmetal grey, unadorned, its surface cool to the touch. There was no dramatic flourish as I brought it out. I set it on my bed, the simple quilt my mother had made a stark contrast to its impersonal, industrial feel. The key for it wasn't hidden under a mattress or in a fancy safe. It was on my keyring, right between the key to my truck and the key to old Mrs. Gable's back door, which I'd been meaning to fix. I'd carried it with me every single day for over a decade, a tiny metallic reminder of a door I had promised myself I would never open. The lock turned with a soft, precise click. There was no puff of dust, no smell of mothballs or forgotten times. Inside there was no gun, no stack of cash, no trophy from a violent past. There were only papers, neat, orderly, and devastating in their implication. On top lay a single faded photograph. It was black and white, the edges slightly dog-eared. The man in it was my great-uncle, Alistair Croft. I barely knew him. He was my grandmother's brother, a spectre who'd appeared at a A handful of family funerals, a tall, gaunt man who stood apart from everyone else. His suit always impeccably tailored, his eyes holding a chill that the photograph had perfectly captured. He never smiled in pictures. He looked like a man who considered smiling a frivolous and unproductive use of facial muscles. I was probably 12 in the memory that surfaced, standing next to him at my grandfather's burial. He'd placed a bony hand on my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong, and said just 2 words, "Be useful." Then he'd turned and walked away, disappearing into a long black car. That was the entirety of our relationship. Beneath the photograph was the letter. The paper was thick, expensive linen stock, embossed with the elegant letterhead of a law firm I'd never heard of before it arrived. It had come about 8 years ago, a few months after Alistair's death. I remembered holding it in this very room, the morning sun shining through the window just as it was now, feeling a profound sense of unreality. The letter was courteous, formal, and utterly life-altering. It informed me that Alistair Croft, a reclusive, self-made industrialist with no wife, no children, and a deep-seated mistrust of anyone who showed him undue affection, had left his entire estate to me. His sole condition was that I had been the only living relative who had never, not once, written to him asking for money, a favor, or an introduction. I had simply existed, unrelated to his world of factories and finance. To him, that made me worthy. The sum was $47 million. I had read that number, then read it again. 47 million. It was an abstract concept, a figure so large it had no tangible meaning in my life of fixing leaky faucets and patching drywall. My first overwhelming feeling hadn't been joy or excitement. It had been a cold dread. It felt like a cage, a gilded one, but a cage nonetheless. That kind of money came with strings, with scrutiny, with a life lived under a microscope. It came with expectations to be a certain kind of person, to run in certain circles, to become, in essence, a version of the severe man in the photograph. I had already walked away from a different life of pressure and performance before Leo was born. I had chosen the simplicity of a hammer in my hand, the honest sweat of a day's work, the peace of a small, quiet house. I had chosen to be a ghost, to live a life so ordinary it became invisible, and so I made a choice. I called the law firm. I instructed them to place the entire fortune into a blind trust, to be managed by their most discreet financial team. I wanted no statements, no updates, no contact. I told them to consider me deceased for all administrative purposes. I hung up the phone, put the letter and the photo in this box, locked it, and placed it behind the blankets. I went back to being a handyman. I went back to being nobody. For years, that decision had felt like wisdom. It was my secret, my private victory over a world that valued portfolios over peace. But now, sitting on the edge of my bed, the cold metal of the box seeping through my worn jeans, that same decision felt like the greatest failure of my life. My silence, my cherished peace, had become a prison for my son. My desire to be invisible had made him feel small. I had let a man like Sterling, a man who built his ego on the perceived weakness of others, crush my boy's spirit because I was too stubborn to use the key I had in my pocket the whole time. This wasn't about buying a mansion or a sports car. This wasn't about flashing wealth to prove a point. As I looked at Alistair's stern, unyielding face in the photograph, I finally understood his two-word command: be useful. For years I thought that meant working with my hands. But I was wrong. True usefulness isn't about fixing things. It's about protecting what matters. It's about using every tool at your disposal to shield the people you love from the cruel, shallow judgments of the world. The $47 million was no longer just a number in a trust fund. It was no longer a threat to my quiet life. In that moment, feeling the ghost of my great-uncle's judgment and the very real pain of my son's humiliation, it transformed. It became a weapon, a precise, surgical, and utterly devastating tool. And for the first time in over a decade, I was no longer a handyman. I was a father, and I was ready to go to war to rebuild my son's future. The silence in my small house had become a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on everything. It was the morning after I'd seen my son, Leo, sitting on the porch with that shattered look in his eyes. The coffee tasted the same, the morning light fell through the window the same way, but I was different. The man who had brewed coffee here for years was gone. In his place was someone I hadn't spoken to in a very long time. I went to the landline phone hanging on the kitchen wall, the one I used for local clients. The number I dialed wasn't local, it was to a law firm in a city I hadn't visited in over a decade. A woman's voice, crisp and professional, answered. "Fairchild, Lowell and Finch, how may I direct your call? Extension 714, please," I said. My voice was calm, but it wasn't my voice. The easy, relaxed tone I used with my neighbors was gone. This was clipped, precise. Each word was a tool, used with intention. There was a click, then a man's voice came on the line. "Jonathan Reed's office." "This is Samuel Croft," I said. There was a pause on the other end. They hadn't heard that name in a long time. "I'd like to activate the Wintergreen protocol." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. The code phrase, something my reclusive great-uncle Alistair had devised as a joke only a paranoid industrialist could love, was the key. It confirmed my identity beyond any doubt and initiated the process of transferring full, active control of the trust to me. "Understood, Mr. Croft," Reed said, his own voice shifting from polite to deferential. "We will begin the immediate transfer of all access and authority. The funds have been held in a diversified portfolio as per the Trust's directives. The current valuation is—" "I'm aware of the valuation," I interrupted, not unkindly, but firmly. "I'll be in touch with specific instructions." I hung up. The call had taken less than 60 seconds. In that time, I had gone from a man with a few $1,000s in the bank to a man with a net worth of over $47 million. The power didn't feel intoxicating. It felt like a heavy, familiar tool being placed back in my hands. It felt like responsibility. My next moves were not about flaunting that power. Buying a sports car or a mansion would have been like using a sledgehammer to drive a finishing nail, crude, obvious, and missing the entire point. This wasn't about becoming what Mr. Sterling was. It was about dismantling the very foundation of what he thought made him superior. I spent the next 2 days in deep, quiet research. My old truck took me not to job sites, but to the public library, where I used their computers to avoid any digital trail leading back to my home. I wasn't just looking at Sterling's car dealerships. I was looking past them. Corporations are like Russian nesting dolls. You have to find the biggest one to control all the smaller ones inside. I found it, a holding company named Apex Consolidated Ventures. It was a bland, forgettable name that held a controlling 51% stake in Sterling's automotive group. Using a complex network of shell corporations set up by the law firm, a structure Alistair had built for precisely this kind of discreet action, I initiated a series of stock purchases. It wasn't a hostile takeover splashed across the business pages. It was a silent, surgical acquisition. Over 72 hours, through a dozen different brokers, I anonymously bought up enough shares to give me a controlling 52% interest in Apex Consolidated. The total cost was a fraction of the trust, a sum so small to me now it was almost an afterthought. But it was the key that unlocked everything. I now owned the company that owned Mr. Sterling. The final step was the meeting. I didn't demand they come to me. I went to them, arriving at the sleek, glass and steel headquarters of Apex Consolidated in my cleanest pair of dark work pants and a simple button-down shirt, the kind I'd wear to estimate a big repair job. I carried no briefcase, just a single slim folder. The board members, a collection of men in suits that cost more than my truck, looked at me with a mixture of confusion and thinly veiled disdain when I was shown into the conference room. They were expecting a billionaire mogul, not a handyman. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I stood at the head of the table and opened my folder. For the next 20 minutes, I laid it all out. I spoke without notes, my voice that same calm, authoritative tone from the phone call. I walked them through Sterling's operations, not from a customer's perspective, but from an owner's. His inventory turnover is 30% below the industry average for the region, I stated, pointing to a chart I'd recreated from memory. He's over-leveraged on floor plan financing, paying crippling interest on sedans that are sitting on his lots for an average of 112 days. His service department has a 70% employee turnover rate due to punitive management and below-market wages, which directly correlates to a customer satisfaction score in the 12th percentile. I detailed his reliance on high-pressure sales tactics that were generating a growing number of complaints with the State Attorney General's office, a looming legal liability they had all overlooked. I showed them how his flagship dealership was, in fact, his most significant financial drain, a vanity project propped up by the profits of his other, smaller locations. I wasn't just a man complaining. I was their majority shareholder presenting an irrefutable audit. The disdain in the room evaporated, replaced by a stunned, focused attention. They were no longer looking at my clothes. They were looking at the cold, hard financial truth I represented. I had the leverage, the controlling vote, and I had just presented them with a compelling, profit-driven reason to use it. The trap for Mr. Sterling was no longer just set. The door had already swung shut, and he didn't even know he was inside. The boardroom was a temple of quiet power. Polished mahogany reflected the soft glow of recessed lighting, and the air smelled of lemon-scented wood polish and old money. I sat at the head of the table, not in a $5,000 suit, but in my cleanest pair of dark work pants and a simple button-down shirt, the kind I'd wear to fix a complex plumbing issue for a neighbor. The faint, honest scent of laundry soap was my cologne. The other board members, men and women, in sharp, expensive tailoring, were silent, their attention fixed on me. They knew who held the keys to the kingdom now. The door opened and Mr. Sterling walked in. It was exactly as I remembered from the one time I'd seen him dropping his daughter off at our modest house, tall, with a perfectly barbered head of silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than my truck. He carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who'd never been told no. Right now, that confidence was tinged with a layer of impatient confusion. He'd been summoned for an urgent review with a new majority stakeholder, a mysterious figure who'd appeared out of nowhere. He didn't even glance my way. His eyes scanned the room, looking for the person of consequence, dismissing the man in work clothes as hired help, perhaps a technician here to fix the projector. "Ah, Charles," the board chairman, a man named Robert, said, his voice calm and even. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Sterling gave a tight, dismissive smile. "Robert, let's not waste time. I have a business to run. Who is this new investor I need to charm?" Robert gestured toward me. "Charles Sterling, I'd like you to meet the new controlling interest in Crestline Holdings. Our single largest shareholder. I watched it happen. It wasn't instantaneous." His gaze, which had slid right over me, snapped back. For a second there was nothing but blank non-recognition, then the first flicker of doubt. His eyes narrowed slightly, tracing the lines of my face, the set of my shoulders. I saw the moment the puzzle pieces connected in his mind. The handyman, the father of the boy he'd forbidden his daughter from seeing, the nobody from the tiny house. The color didn't just drain from his face, It seemed to be physically pulled from his skin, leaving a waxy grey pallor. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a slow-dawning, gut-wrenching horror. He was looking at the man he'd scorned, and that man was now sitting in the seat of ultimate power over his entire life's work. The room was utterly silent, the only sound, the faint hum of the climate control. I let the silence stretch, let him stand there in the wreckage of his own assumptions. I saw him replay every condescending word, every judgment he'd passed. I saw him realizing that the foundation of his superiority, his wealth, his status, his empire was now sand, and I was the one holding the tide. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I leaned forward just slightly, my hands resting flat on the polished wood. My hands with their calluses and the faint permanent lines of grime no amount of scrubbing could ever fully erase. I looked him directly in the eye, and I spoke quietly, my words measured and clear, each one a carefully placed stone. "You judged my son's future," I began, "based on the dirt under my fingernails." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. He flinched as if I'd struck him. "You were wrong," I continued, my tone still even, devoid of anger, but filled with a finality that was colder and more absolute than any shout could ever be. "Your judgment is poor. You looked at a young man's character and saw only his father's bank account. You looked at my hands and saw a lack of ambition instead of the skill and the will to build and to fix. A man who cannot see true value is a liability in any enterprise. And as of today, your services are no longer required by this company." The words landed not like a hammer, but like a guillotine, clean, final. He stared, his jaw working, trying to form a protest, a plea, anything. But there was nothing to say. Robert, the chairman, gave a single curt nod. "The board has already voted, Charles. The motion to terminate your position and sever all ties, effective immediately, has passed. Security will escort you to clear your personal effects." 2 men in suits appeared at the door. Sterling didn't move. He just stood there, a statue of a ruined man, his empire, his entire identity, collapsing not in a fiery crash, but in the quiet, decisive words of the nobody he'd thought beneath his notice. He was led from the room without another word, the echo of his footsteps, the only sound marking the end of his reign. The boardroom was silent again. The deed was done. The key turned in the lock with the same familiar, slightly gritty sound it always made. I pushed the door open and stepped into the quiet of the house, hanging my worn jacket on the hook by the door. The air smelled of the same cheap coffee I'd brewed that morning. Everything was in its place. The small frayed rug by the door, the photograph of a younger Leo on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator. It was all exactly as I had left it, a perfect snapshot of the simple, unassuming life I had so carefully built. But the silence in the room had a different texture tonight. It was a heavy, waiting silence. I walked into the living room, and there he was. Leo was on the couch, but he wasn't slouched, wasn't scrolling on his phone. He was sitting bolt upright, his back rigid, his eyes fixed on the television. The local business channel was on, the volume low. A serious-faced anchor was speaking over a graphic that featured a photo of a stunned-looking Mr. Sterling. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Shock exit. Local auto magnate. Sterling ousted in surprise board vote." He didn't turn as I entered. He just sat there, the flickering blue light from the screen playing across his face. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes, the pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed suddenly, violently, snapping into place. The glorified janitor father, the anonymous majority stakeholder, the quiet, precise man who fixed locks, and the man who could dismantle an empire with a single phone call. The contradiction was too vast, too impossible, and yet the evidence was right there on the screen. I didn't say anything. I just walked over to my usual armchair, the one with the faint stain on the arm from where I'd spilled coffee years ago, and I sat down. The springs groaned their familiar complaint. I let the silence stretch, letting him sit with the enormity of it. His gaze slowly drifted from the television to me. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a profound, staggering confusion. It was the look of someone who has just discovered a secret door in a house they've lived in their entire life. "Leo," I said, my voice calm, the same tone I used when explaining how to fix a leaky faucet. He just shook his head, a tiny, helpless motion. "The news, they said it was a holding company, a silent partner." His voice was a hoarse whisper. "That was you." I nodded slowly. "It was. But how? Why?" The questions tumbled out, stripped of the anger and resentment that had colored his voice for weeks. Now there was only a desperate need to understand. This was the moment. This was the conversation I had walked away from a fortune to avoid. The conversation I now had to save the very thing I'd been trying to protect. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and looked directly at my son. "A long time ago, before you were born, I inherited a great deal of money from a relative I barely knew," I began, my voice level and even. "A man named Alistair Croft. It was more money than you can probably imagine, enough to buy this whole town and everything in it. And when I got it, I had a choice. I could step into that world, a world of portfolios and power plays, of boardrooms and people who judge your worth by the car you drive. Or I could walk away." I paused, letting him absorb that. "I chose to walk away, Leo. I let the money sit. I put it in a box and I locked it away. I became a handyman. I bought this small house. I chose this life because I believed a quiet life, a life where you work with your hands and see the direct result of your labor, was a better teacher than a privileged one. I thought it would teach you humility. I thought it would teach you the real value of things. I thought I was protecting you from becoming like him." I gestured slightly toward the television, where Sterling's photo was now gone, replaced by a stock market graph. I saw the understanding begin to dawn in his eyes, mixed with a fresh wave of shame as he remembered his own words, the insults he'd hurled at this life I'd built for us. "But I was wrong," I said, and my voice softened, losing its analytical edge and filling with a sincerity I rarely showed. "I was wrong to let you feel small because of my choice. I was so focused on giving you a peaceful life that I failed to see I was letting the world make you feel insignificant. I let you believe that our circumstances defined our worth, and for that I am truly sorry." I looked at him, my boy, who had been so crushed by the weight of a judgment I had the power to lift all along. "Your value, Leo, was never, ever in my bank account. It's in here." I tapped my temple, and in here I placed a hand over my heart. "It's in your intelligence, your resilience, even your anger, because it comes from a place that wants more for itself. Your value is yours. I removed an obstacle. I showed one arrogant man that the ground he stood on wasn't as solid as he thought. I did it so you would never have to doubt your place in this world again. So you would know with absolute certainty that you come from a line of men who can build things, and when necessary, we can also dismantle the things that stand in our way. You will never have to feel small on my account again. That is my promise to you." We sat there then, in the quiet living room, the only sound the low murmur of the television. The world outside had shifted on its axis, but in here, in this small, tidy house, a new foundation was being laid. Not of money, but of truth. And for the first time in a long time, the silence between us felt peaceful. The old truck still rumbles to life with that same familiar cough, but these days I'm not heading out to unclog a drain or patch a roof for Mrs. Gable down the street. I'm driving to my son's business. It still feels strange to think that. My son, a business. Owner, Leo's Makerspace. It sits in a refurbished warehouse on the edge of town, a place that used to store tractor parts and now hums with the sound of 3D printers, laser cutters, and the low buzz of focused conversation. I pull into the gravel lot, the same one I've parked in for months, and just sit for a minute, watching through the large, street-facing window. He's in there, Leo, but he's not the boy I saw on the porch that night, his spirit looking like it had been stepped on. That version of my son feels like a photograph from someone else's life. This Leo moves with a quiet assurance. He's helping a couple of teenagers calibrate a CNC router, his hands gesturing, his voice calm and instructive. He's not showing off, he's sharing. That's the core of the place, his idea from the start, a community hub where anyone, from a retired engineer to a high school kid with a wild idea, can come and build something. I get out of the truck and walk in. The bell on the door jingles, a sound I installed for him. He looks up from the machine and a genuine, easy smile breaks across his face. No hesitation, no shadow of embarrassment, just, "Hey, Dad." That single word delivered like that is worth more than every dollar in that trust fund. "Everything running smooth?" I ask, running a hand over the workbench he built himself. Solid, well joined. He learned that from me. "Better than smooth," he says, wiping his hands on a rag. "The coding club from the high school is coming in this afternoon. They're designing their own drone frames. We're going to print them next week." He leads me on a small tour, not because I don't know where's the place, but because he's proud of it and he wants to share that pride with me. This was his vision. I provided the initial silent capital, a small, manageable sum from the inheritance, and my practical guidance on the build-out. But the concept, the drive, the soul of this place, that's all him. He combined the tech skills he'd always had a knack for with the hands-on, fix-it knowledge he'd absorbed from a lifetime of watching me. He saw a need in this town for a place where ideas could become tangible, and he filled it. We still live in our small house. People probably wonder about that. After everything that happened with Sterling, after the quiet rumors that must have circulated, they might expect a mansion on the hill. But this house isn't just a structure, it's our home. The creak on the third stair is the same one I've been meaning to fix for a decade. The kitchen is still where we eat dinner together most nights, talking about his day, about my day. The difference is the atmosphere, the oppressive weight of shame, the unspoken tension that used to cling to the walls like old paint is gone. It's been scrubbed clean, replaced by a profound and simple understanding. My work is different now too. I still take on the occasional odd job for my longtime neighbors, but it's a choice. It's because I enjoy the puzzle of a stubborn engine or the simple satisfaction of restoring a squeaky hinge to silent operation. It's a passion, not a necessity. The financial security is a deep, quiet bedrock under our lives, a fact we both know but rarely discuss. It's not the point anymore. The real wealth, the fortune I almost foolishly locked away, is what I see in my son's eyes every day. It's the confidence that comes not from a bank statement, but from knowing his own capabilities. It's the respect he shows me, not for the power I wielded in a boardroom for one afternoon, but for the man I am and for the trust I finally placed in him. We have an understanding now that runs deeper than words. He knows why I hid our past. I know why he felt the way he did. There are no more secrets between us, just the quiet, solid truth of who we are, father and son, partners in building a future that is truly our own. The coffee in our mugs in the morning tastes the same, but everything else, everything that truly matters, tastes infinitely sweeter. For most of my adult life, I believed that a man's worth was something he built quietly, like a stone wall, one rock at a time, unseen by the world. I thought it was in the honest sweat, the fixed leaky faucet, the satisfaction of a job done well with my own 2 hands. I believed my value was in the peace I had carved out for us, in the silence I had chosen. I was wrong, or at least I was only half right. A man's worth isn't in what he has, or even in the quiet dignity of his daily labor. It's in what he's willing to do, what he's willing to become, to protect what matters. For me, that was my son. For years I thought protecting him meant shielding him from the shadow of a past I'd left behind. I hid from that man I used to be, the one who thought in leverage and strategy, who saw people as pieces on a board, because I believed that man was dangerous. I thought peace was the ultimate prize, and I had won it. I had traded portfolios for peace, power for a small, tidy house, and the simple rhythm of a handyman's life. But I learned a brutal, beautiful lesson through all of this. True strength isn't in hiding. Hiding is just a different kind of prison. True strength is in knowing when to stand up. It's in the precise, calculated moment when you decide that the peace you've built is worth shattering if it means saving the person you built it for. That moment for me wasn't in a boardroom. It was on my back porch, watching my son's shoulders slump with a defeat I had, through my own silence, allowed him to feel. That was the moment the lion stopped napping. You see, people make a critical mistake. They look at a quiet man, a man who doesn't speak unless he has to, a man who seems content with his simple life, and they mistake that quiet for weakness. They see the worn jeans, the calloused hands, the modest home, and they write a story in their heads about a lack of ambition, a lack of legacy. They think they see the whole man. They don't. They're only seeing the chapter he's living in now. Sometimes the quietest man in the room isn't the weakest. He's just waiting. He's gathering his strength, conserving his energy. He's watching and learning and understanding the landscape better than anyone shouting ever could. He's waiting for the right reason to speak, for the right person to fight for. And when that reason comes, his voice doesn't need to be loud to carry weight. It just needs to be true. It just needs to be backed by a will that has been tempered in silence and a power that has been held in reserve for a lifetime. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you're in a room, any room, a meeting, a coffee shop, a school function, look at the man sitting quietly in the corner. The one who isn't trying to prove anything. The one who seems ordinary. Remember my story. Remember that the dirt under his fingernails might be from a garden he tends for pleasure, not necessity. Remember that the calm in his eyes might be the calm of a storm that has already passed, or one he knows exactly how to summon. Remember that before you judge the man next to you, you should consider that you might not know his story. You might not know what he's capable of. You might not know what he's chosen to walk away from, or what he would be willing to pick back up again for a cause that matters. He might just be a lion taking a nap, and you never, ever want to be the one foolish enough to mistake his rest for surrender.